You'll probably have noticed that tensions across the Ukrainian border have been rising, and things are getting serious. Want some evidence? Well, firstly, in anticipation of conflict, diplomats have started leaving Kiev. Russia started evacuating its staff in early January, and so far Canada, the US, the UK, Germany and Australia have followed suit. Secondly, the West has stepped up its sanctions and continued to provide military aid to Ukraine, while Russia's troop build-up on the border has continued, with an estimated 125,000 Russian troops now within striking distance of Ukraine. And thirdly, on Wednesday, during a debate in the Duma about recognising the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, an MP for the pro-Putin United Russia Party said that war had become, quote, a direct necessity. But despite the escalating tension, war hasn't happened yet. And that's left everyone asking the same question. Will Putin actually invade? Now, obviously, we don't know the answer to this question. Only Putin could know, and even then it's possible he hasn't made up his mind yet. So what we're going to do in this video is first list the evidence that suggests he won't invade, and then take a look at the evidence that suggests he will, and then you can make your own mind up about it. But before we get into the evidence on either side, if you want more updates on the Russia-Ukraine situation, then be sure to subscribe to this channel and TLDR Global for every update. Currently, less than a third of you are subscribed. So if you want to know everything that's going on, stay informed and help us out, then be sure to hit the button and ring the bell. Anyway, as we see it, there are three main pieces of evidence that suggest that Putin won't invade. Firstly, if he was going to invade, he would have done so by now, because as time goes on, invasion just gets harder. Secondly, Putin has made no attempt to prepare the Russian public for a full-on war in Ukraine. And thirdly, the annexation of Crimea has actually pushed Ukraine further from Russia, and a similar invasion of Donbass is likely to do the same. But let's take a look at those reasons one by one, starting with the first reason. The longer Putin waits, the more difficult invasion becomes. This is mainly because, as time has gone on, Western solidarity has improved. And in turn, this means that the scope of sanctions has grown and the Ukrainian military has become better prepared. Just a few months ago, the EU was split over how to respond to Russia's aggression on the Ukrainian border, with the Germans and French urging caution, while the US and various Central European countries insisted that the West needed a stronger response. For example, the new German Chancellor originally ruled out scrapping Nord Stream 2 and reaffirmed Germany's commitment to a constructive dialogue, while Macron responded to a US intelligence assessment in December suggesting that Putin could invade in January by warning against self-fulfilling prophecies. Poland and Lithuania were on the other side of the spectrum though, arguing in December for preemptive sanctions on Moscow. Now, we're not taking a position on which approach was correct here. That's a topic for a whole different video. We're just saying that since then, the West's position has converged somewhat. Macron has now endorsed heavy sanctions, saying that Russia will pay a very heavy price in the event of any invasion. And in January, Scholz U-turned and implied that Nord Stream 2 could be used as a deterrent against invasion. More than that, sanctions have now been expanded to potentially include not just Nord Stream 2, but also personal sanctions on Putin and the expulsion of Russia from the SWIFT banking system. Now, of course, it's important not to overstate Western solidarity. There are still disagreements between NATO states about the best way to respond. For instance, Germany, Italy and Sweden have refused to send arms to Ukraine. Although Germany did recently send them 5,000 helmets. And Croatia, a NATO member, recently announced that it would recall its NATO troops in the event of a Russian invasion. Disagreeing with them on the other side, though, the UK, US and Denmark have sent Ukraine some $600 million worth of arms in the last year or so, and the US has just put 8,500 troops on heightened alert in anticipation of Russian invasion. Regardless though, it's still true that since December, the West has converged around a tougher position against Russia, and this has led to tougher sanctions and more military aid in Ukraine. So if Putin did want to invade, he really ought to have done so sooner. The second piece of evidence that suggests that Putin isn't actually planning an invasion is the fact that he hasn't yet prepared the Russian public. For years, pollsters have found that most Russians would prefer that their country and Ukraine remain friendly neighbours, and any invasion would likely incur serious casualties and economy-crippling sanctions, in a country where GDP per capita has already fallen by 35% since 2013. So, it will be sensible for Putin to prepare the Russian public for this kind of eventuality. And this is why, before the annexation of Crimea, Putin engaged in a massive domestic propaganda blitz. So far, though, domestic Russian coverage of the situation in Ukraine has been conspicuously muted. On the Tuesday evening news, for example, Ukraine was the fourth story on both Channel 1 and NTV. And on Russia 1, Ukraine wasn't even mentioned until nearly an hour into the broadcast. You get the point, though. Unlike Crimea in 2014, Putin hasn't done anything to prepare the Russian public, which suggests that he's not actually serious about an invasion. The third and final piece of evidence we're going to be looking at is Crimea. Because, if anything, Russia's annexation of Crimea actually pushed the rest of Ukraine further away from Russia. Why? Well, annexing Crimea did two things. Firstly, it changed the parliamentary arithmetic in Ukraine away from Russia, and secondly, made the rest of Ukraine more firmly anti-Russian. Ukraine has a stark ethno-linguistic divide between Ukrainian speakers in the north and Russian speakers in the south, which used to translate some pretty even political divides. For example, in the 2004 election, northern Ukraine voted for a candidate who was backed by the EU and US, while southern Ukraine, including Crimea, voted firmly for a candidate who was backed by Putin. And the same thing happened in 2010. And these elections were close. In 2004, Yushchenko won with 52% of the vote, and in 2010, Yanukovych won with 49% of the vote. By annexing the mostly Russian-speaking Crimea, home to about 5% of Ukraine's population, Putin made the electoral arithmetic a lot more difficult for any pro-Russian candidate, and precipitated a steep drop in Russian attitudes towards Russia, with the number of Ukrainians feeling positively about Russia falling by 50%. All in all, Putin's invasion of Crimea pushed Ukraine further from Russia, and a similar invasion in Donbass would presumably do the same thing, which, assuming Putin knows this, suggests that he won't actually invade. But what about the other side? Let's take a look at reasons why Putin will invade. And again, we've got three pieces of evidence. Firstly, the window of opportunity for Putin is closing. Secondly, the continued troop build-up. And thirdly, the fact that despite all of the consequences, Putin still invaded Crimea. The first reason, the window of opportunity closing. For the reasons we've just described, Ukraine is tilting ever more westward. We're not saying that it's anything like a modern European state just yet, but Ukrainians are increasingly apprehensive about Putin and Russia. So, if Putin wants to get Ukraine under Russia's sphere of influence, then he knows he'll have to do it sooner rather than later, before Ukraine becomes irreversibly Western and anti-Russia. And this might plausibly be his last chance. The second piece of evidence which makes invasion more likely is the fact that Putin has continued to build up troops on the border. While a full-scale invasion looks unlikely, it would require probably double the current number of troops and a greater number of mobile hospitals. The increased number of troops is consistent with plans for what Biden would describe as a minor incursion. Perhaps most worryingly, though, the fact that Putin has begun sending forces from its eastern military district over 6,000 kilometers from Ukraine, as well as sending stocks of food, fuels and lubricants, suggests that he's serious about invasion. And the third and final piece of evidence is Crimea itself. You might think that considering the scope of the sanctions and international blowback, Putin wouldn't be able to afford to invade Donbass. But a similar calculation applied to Crimea too. Putin must have known that he'd face massive international sanctions, which is exactly what happened, and he still decided to go ahead with it. This suggests that Putin prioritizes geostrategic aims over basically anything else. So, no matter how well equipped Ukraine's military is, or how serious the proposed sanctions become, invasion is always a plausible outcome. You get the point. The fact that Putin invaded Crimea tells us something about his geostrategic calculus, which implies that the invasion of Donbass is always a real option. Anyway, so that's all the evidence we have for and against invasion. But what do you think? Will Putin invade, or is this all a massive bluff? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, remember to check out TLDR Global and the playlist linked in the description for all of our Ukraine-Russia content. As always, you can also subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.